Wilson from the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department here at William Patterson University. We have a unique group of scholars and students today that all practice anti-racism in their teaching, scholarship, and service. Being anti-racist is fighting against racism. To be anti-racist is to be someone who is committed to abolishing racist thoughts, practices, policies, and institutions. In the Black Lives Matter era, where being anti-racist has become popular and a catchphrase for some, it is extremely important that we move past intellectualizing about anti-racism and move toward eradicating systems of oppression. To me, being anti-racist is about calling out individuals and institutions for oppressive policies and practices and fighting to transform spaces to make them more inclusive and democratic. Being anti-racist is about reimagining and fighting for a society that values everyone's lived experiences and decenters whiteness. Racism emerges in the academy in many ways, from the types of classes that are offered in academic programs, to the suppression of minoritized students' expression and creativity in undergraduate and graduate programs, and in hiring and retention practices where minoritized scholars often get the short end of the stick. If we are committed to making the academy more inclusive and democratic, we all must embrace anti-racist practice. Some of us have engaged anti-racist praxis throughout our lives and careers, and others are new to the anti-racist space. If we want to transform and decolonize disciplines in society, we all must find ways to abolish oppressive policies, practices, and institutions. This panel seeks to highlight the works of scholars and graduate students who have committed to being fearless anti-racist warriors. These courageous scholars and students not only engage research and teaching utilizing an anti-racist lens, but most importantly, they practice anti-racism in their daily lives. Tonight's panel will examine the many ways one can engage anti-racist praxis in the academy. Thank you for joining us. And just so you all know, this panel is being recorded. So if you don't feel comfortable potentially being recorded in the Q&A section, you can feel free to step away. So after I introduce the panelists, we'll proceed to a discussion. And then at around 7:45, I'll open up the Q&A component of the panel. So save all your questions for Q&A. Thank you. So our first panelist is Dr. Jane Palmer, who is a professional lecturer in the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology, and the director of the Community-Based Research Scholars Program at American University in Washington, D.C. She is also a faculty affiliate at AU's Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, a faculty fellow with the Metropolitan Policy Center, and a non-resident fellow in community engaged methods at the Urban Institute. At AU, she has been involved in a variety of anti-racist initiatives, including helping to design the curriculum for a mandatory anti-oppression course for all first-year students, the development of the parameters for required upper-level diversity and equity courses, and an active participant in a faculty learning community on an inclusive pedagogy. Our next panelist is Alondra D. Garza, who is a third-year doctoral student in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Sam Houston State University. Her research focuses on victimology, violence against women, and the criminal legal response to victimization. She is a recipient of the 2020 Graduate Student Award from the Victimology section of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences and the 2020 Graduate Scholar Award from the Division of Women in Crime of the American Society of Criminology. Her recent work has appeared in Criminal Justice and Behavior, crime and delinquency, and violence against women, among others. Our next panelist is Dr. Erin Nicole O'Neill, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Sam Houston State University. Her research focuses on sexual assault case processing and has appeared in a variety of well-respected mainstream and specialty journals, including Justice Quarterly, Violence Against Women, Crime and Delinquency, and Journal of Interpersonal Violence. She has received 7 national awards for her research and teaching contributions to the discipline. In addition to her national awards, Erin received the 2019 Outstanding Faculty Award in Research from the College of Criminal Justice at Sam Houston State University and the 2020 Alumni Scholar Award from the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. Our next panelist is Amy A. Martinez, who is a first-generation systems-impacted Chicana scholar activist from a working-class neighborhood in Southern California. She is currently a doctoral candidate at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York. She holds a BA in sociology with an emphasis in crime, law, and deviance from UC Santa Barbara, and an MA in criminal justice from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She is expected to graduate with her doctoral degree in criminal justice spring 22 and will be pursuing a career in academia. She recently launched Calibre, a collective created specifically for Latina doctoral students across academic disciplines who are deeply committed to decolonizing the way we think about practice and embody what it means to be a scholar. This initiative came from personal experiences with a lack of resources and mentorship that were culturally relevant to her needs as a Chicana doctoral student pursuing postgraduate education and beyond. She is committed to continue breaking the barriers that hinder Latina scholars from thriving in academia. And last but not least, our next panelist is Marissa Salinas, who is a doctoral candidate at UC Santa Barbara, sociology, where she holds a race, ethnicity, and nation, REN, concentration in Black studies emphasis. Connecting the experiences of formerly incarcerated Latinas to Latina professors with PhDs from carceral communities, her research seeks to disrupt the exceptionality and disposability spectrum by interrogating how neoliberal institutions utilize mechanisms of social control to socially reproduce inequality for Latinas. Marissa received bachelor's degrees in sociology and Chicana studies from UC Santa Barbara and a master's in sociology from San Diego State University. A mother scholar, Marissa centers intersectional Marxism in her research, pedagogy, and mentorship of multiply marginalized students from across the academy. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. So I'm going to start off the panel with our first question. What does anti-racist praxis mean to you? And what led you to pursue doing anti-racist work?
I can start. I think that anti-racist praxis is essentially taking a stance. I think that the neoliberal university has the propensity to kind of play this race neutral card and have these colorblind policies that render everybody from across the campus community, as well as the communities that surround these universities, as null and void and secondary to like this capitalist project of white supremacist capitalist project, let me be clear, of the university. So to me, it means that regardless of what stature and position you have within the university, that you're actively taking a counter-hegemonic stance and you're calling out institutions, you're calling out people. You're also, because let's be real, we're embedded within the neoliberal university, we have specific roles. So I think that oftentimes, not to go too far on a tangent, but oftentimes I think that, sometimes scholars, even scholars of color, can, be interrogated like, oh, you're still within the neoliberal university, you're still implicated. And so it requires us to also do committee work, doing the inside work that's within the bureaucratic channels, but also engaging and mobilizing our students and the surrounding community. So that's what it means to me. It means really being courageous when it comes down to calling out white supremacy.
That was so beautifully said, Marisa. Just kind of echoing on some of the things that Marisa just mentioned. I think for me, anti-racism in the academy is starting to look a little different, because I feel like as a scholar of color, obviously there's not many scholars of color for me to be mentored by. Like in my department that I'm currently at, I don't think we have any Chicano, Mexican, Latino criminologists, right? And so I'm here navigating, this space on my own as a Chicana. But in my former doctoral program that I was in at UC Berkeley, where I was surrounded by faculty that looked like me, I oftentimes found that even professors of color have internalized, I don't know if you'd call it racism or internal colonialism. They've internalized something, right? In such a way that they then perpetuate that toxic notion of white professionalism, right? And will haze you because they went through it. I cannot tell y'all how many times I've asked professors of color for some kind of mentorship, and some of the responses, I'm just like, what? What happened to paying it forward and reaching back to those coming after you, right? So I feel like, as a graduate student, it's a little bit hard for me, I think, to be brave and call out those professors, especially if they are names in the field already. But best believe that when I get my tenure position somewhere, that I have a laundry list of people I'm coming for, you know what I mean? I think it is important to start, I don't like to necessarily call out people, but call attention to individuals who are perpetuating the status quo within the academy, whether they're white and or of color,
Yeah, that really resonates with me. Andrea, Amy, so I think for me as a cis woman who's white, that my journey in this sphere has been a little bit different. For me, it's really been investigating and understanding not only my own complicity over the last 10 years in maintaining these structures of oppression, but also trying to bring attention to my fellow white colleagues about how we've been complicit within my college and department specifically, but then also within the larger discipline, for example, the Division on Women in Crime. I think that, I teach gender and crime and I teach feminist criminology, and I'll be the first to admit to my students and my colleagues about how for the first decade in my career, I very much did engage mostly white feminist ideas. And I think that acknowledging that is a problem and acknowledging how I specifically myself has been complicit has been really important to my own praxis and my own practice. What brought me to, this place in my career is I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I now find myself in rural Texas, and it is a very different environment. And I think it's really important that students hear from somebody who is different than the other instructors who they're exposed to, who often have police backgrounds. Before we were starting, we were talking about how a lot of our students want to go on to become law enforcement officers, police officers, correctional officers. And if they're only hearing from people who have been embedded in those institutions, then that can, cause a very kind of one-sided education. And so I think that a lot of what I try to bring is my upbringing from Los Angeles and really trying to investigate my own complicity and also white people's complicity, white women specifically, in perpetuating white supremacy within the academy.
I think you bring up really good points, Erin, because I think part of this anti-racist praxis, right, even within ourselves who are already committed to doing the work, this is like a continuous recommitment, right, to re-examine our own actions and calling out our own colleagues and sort of like checking ourselves. And it has to be a continuous recommitment that welcomes, you know, criticism from like, hey, you know, that's not cool. Calling out institutions, policies, even your colleagues who do some things that are, you know, like, I don't know about that. But like, you have to be open and welcome to that criticism in order to have this expansion and reimagine what the academy will look like, right, in terms of teaching, pedagogy, and service. I myself accidentally ended up getting a PhD, I think mostly out of spite. I didn't think I would get a PhD, but, you know, I was doing research in my master's program and someone from another department was like, can you help us? We don't have any Spanish speaking interviewers to interview sex trafficking victims in the greater Houston area, most of which were Latinas and undocumented. And so I was like, hold on, like, you know, how do I fit in here? How can I do something with my work? Like, now I got to go fix things. So, you know, here we are accidentally in the academy trying to make it a better space for everyone.
Yeah, that's great. I agree that it's sort of figuring out how we do the work on all those levels. And I think it's also about how we show up in I'll speak for myself, how I show up in space. That tension between being vulnerable, allowing to be vulnerable in a space and also owning your privilege very openly. And related to what Erin was saying about complicity, I think we're all in a criminology department, and I think we need to really own the complicity of criminology in the structural racism that's perpetuated every day in what we're talking about in our classrooms, what we're reading about, what we're researching about, and being a voice that helps to interrogate that. And I teach mostly research methods classes, but something that one of my soapboxes is we're not looking at the impacts of race on something, we're looking at the impacts of racism on something, and how are we measuring that and how are we having those conversations. I think it's also about decentering whiteness in the academy. I come to this work, per Sean, your second part of the question, after a decade of community work and like community organizing and advocacy and working in community-based organizations in communities of color, with communities of color. And so coming to the academy, I was like, crises in higher ed just did not make sense to me. Like, I would be like, this is not a crisis. I'm used to having a woman sitting across from me who has nowhere to go. That is a crisis. Can we just take a deep breath here and figure out what actually is going on? And I chose not to go into a tenure track position, partially because of some of what was already said around sort of this publish or perish mentality. I became a researcher because when I worked in community and I was working in nonprofits, we never had the data we needed to get the grants or to demonstrate that we were doing something good with what we were doing with the money we had. And I created the Community-Based Research Scholars Program for that praxis. And that's why I really was excited about the title of this panel, because of the praxis of how we implement it. We show, we don't tell. I rarely would call myself an anti-racist. I want my behaviors to be such that I don't have to name that. But working with communities and breaking down those, being a different kind of academic, and breaking down those sort of like expectations and assumptions and stereotypes about what an academic is like with community and in having these conversations.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Dr. Palmer. And I think it's important for us to use our research, right? If we claim to be committed to anti-racism, if we claim to be committed to social justice, if we claim to be committed to eradicating systems of oppression, then we must use our knowledge, our privilege to help to transform and empower oppressed communities. So like you mentioned, the work that you do in the community, the work that I do in the community, I'm not doing my scholarship and research to impress, fellow privileged academics. And I oftentimes think about what Dr. Jason Williams always says, that he cares mostly about what the community thinks about him and his work. And I'm similar. Like I care about what the community thinks about the work that I'm doing. I don't care about what some armchair theorist thinks about my research. That's not who I'm doing it for. I'm doing it to empower people who don't have a voice. And so I think it's important for us to do that with research, because otherwise we're wasting our space, right? We're sitting in these nice, cushy offices and we're not doing anything to transform communities. You know, where I'm at William Patterson, we're right next door to Patterson. So I'm always in Patterson doing work. I was there today engaging in community-based research with the formerly incarcerated. So it's like a lot of institutions, right, are situated in urban settings, but they're not doing anything to transform communities. They claim to be committed to anti-racism and diversity inclusion, but what are you doing in the community? Are you using any resources to help out the community? Right. And so I know my institution now, right, our president is actually committed to being involved in the community. So I think it's important for institutions, right, to re-examine what scholarship looks like and what scholarship we value. And I think that's been, you know, a challenge and a problem, especially when you think about, you know, the divide between qualitative and quantitative research, especially in our discipline, criminology and criminal justice, right? We found that our discipline is very, you know, racist, oppressive, and against qualitative research, because oftentimes qualitative research, right, seeks to foreground the lived experiences and perspectives of the marginalized. And so oftentimes, right, the state in mainstream journals and institutions, right, in criminology and criminal justice, don't want to hear or don't care about the voices of the marginalized. And so I think that's important that we commit ourselves to foregrounding those experiences. The next question I have for all of you is, how do you implement anti-racist praxis into your scholarship and teaching?
I think for me, so just a little bit of background on the kind of research that I do. I've been doing a longitudinal qualitative study on the policing of Mexican Chicano gang associated boys and men in Santa Barbara, California. And it was interesting when I first started my PhD program. I don't know, I didn't know that my campus was like a pro cop college. So when I started talking about, you know, I believe in prison and police abolition, right, and was very outwardly open about that, like kind of responses and looks that I got from my peers, colleagues and professors was a little like it was very shocking to me, because coming from UC Berkeley to like John Jay, completely different in terms of culture, space, just everything, right? But I really like, throughout my first 2 years in the department and having to take the coursework that is required of us in our first 2 years, I just had to like name the fact that criminology itself is very problematic, right? And that if we really are committed to, you know, committed to social justice or racial justice as the way that it's painted literally on our walls of our campus, then we need to also center the voices of scholars of color. In my theory course, I think the only scholar of color that we had, and this was a 2-part semester class, the professor, a white man, I had asked him like, hey, how come we're only reading Du Bois for a theory? Like there's so many other theorists outside of the US, within the US, like why are they not here? And he wasn't able to give me a response, right? And so for me, in my own scholarship, I've been very proactive about decriminalizing and rehumanizing the population of people that I'm studying, right? And even decolonizing the way that I talk about the people that I'm in community with, right? That I'm researching. And very much, I feel like a protectiveness when I'm in my department and when I was in those classrooms, right? That I was, you know, mandated to take, you know, to call people out about the way that they would even talk about people that they were studying, right? For example, one of my colleagues, you know, the way that they were talking about incarcerated peoples, like I had to speak up, you know, and I feel like I did kind of pay a little price in being vocal about how uncomfortable I was with even the language that was being used in the classroom, and how professors that were, managing our classes, like weren't like calling those students, out or calling them in about the language, just really reminded me of the importance of like even my own existence in the classroom is like a form of anti-racist work, right? Because I'm the one who has to endure and teach people like, hey, you know what, that's problematic and this is why. But then you get so exhausted at some point, like I know for myself, I just stopped talking in class. But I think that also pushing back against the mainstream canon of criminology or criminal justice works is also a practice of being anti-racist in higher education, because like really only Du Bois, like out of every, like that's all we could read to teach us a little bit of theory about the populations that we study. I just found that like such a cop out for the professor to not just be real and say, hey, you know what, yeah, we're only using white scholars and that's an issue and I'm gonna fix it. Like,
So I'm currently teaching research design at the doctoral level, and a lot of what Amy just discussed, I noticed I pulled a lot of previous syllabi to see kind of what students were being exposed to. And it was mostly quant heavy with, one week at best dedicated to qualitative analyses. And so, the students that are in my class this semester are being exposed to Black feminist inquiry, Indigenous methods, queer theory, and trying to really, it's a different format. And I think that the students probably haven't been exposed to research design in this format, but I think that it's important to infuse these, wide perspectives in all of our classes, not just gender and crime, not just feminist criminology. A lot of what Amy said that she experiences in the classroom, I try to actively combat in the undergraduate and graduate classroom. I try to elevate perspectives that are not mainstream. I do not care about neutrality in my classrooms. When we're talking about people's lives, I don't think it's important to discuss both sides of an argument when people's lives are at stake. And I tell my students that, they can get the police apologist crap in somebody else's class because they can. And that I come from a critical criminological perspective, that I am, I don't believe that the police can be reformed, and that my perspective is also informed in research and lived experiences and scholarship. And so, I think that when I was an early educator, I was really obsessed with the survey style of teaching, exposing students to as much as I could within a 16-week course so they would have, a foundation of knowledge. And then I realized that there's no way that you can cover everything. And so that it's more important that my syllabus is not only an ideological stance, but also a political stance and an anti-racist stance. And so I don't assign problematic authors, even if they're considered famous people in the field. If they have harmful ideas about sex, gender, race, I don't care if they at one time had very important things to say. There are people who are saying more important things now that I think are more relevant to students' lives and also the discipline. And so for me, I think that, with teaching, speaking specifically to teaching, it is exposing students to counter stories and ensuring that, I don't really bring in a lot of mainstream criminological theories or works into my gender and crime, feminist criminology, or even research design class, because students can get that other places. And I don't know if I answered the question, but that's all I'm going to say.
I would say for me, if you're going to come into my class, you're going to come in for a whole experience. You better be ready. Like, we start from the get-go. So from the beginning, I think that part of the anti-racist praxis specifically looks at, right away, first day, we talk about subjectivity versus objectivity and how that does not exist, how objectivity doesn't exist. And we segue into that in the same lecture into intersectionality and how all of their various identities coalesce into this kind of kaleidoscopic identity formation that informs all of these different issues, and literally the material resources that they've had access to, and how that then impacts how they see the world, right? So that's kind of a get-go. Another thing is my syllabi for whatever class I'm teaching from the get-go is going to be primarily scholars of color. Like, that's just a given. Because the fact of the matter is they've been exposed to white scholars. They've been exposed to white cis scholars, and primarily male scholars, men scholars, their entire lives. They're going to get that. They've gotten that hit over their head since they were kids, you know what I mean? And they're going to get it somewhere else. They're not going to get the type of material that I can provide them. So then I also, part of it is like really valuing their lived experiences. I being able to value their lived experiences, and knowing that these students, and a lot of my students, that will look for me are students of color, first gen students, working class folks. They kind of, it's funny, like they find us, right? Like they know who their people are. But they come in and I right away value, and I tell them, like, you have funds of knowledge and you're going to mobilize them in this class. And so I value those just as much as if they're diving into these books, and because sometimes I have students that can read so much and can cite all these citations, and they're not critical at all. I tell them something off the cusp, and to really engage critically with something, and they're like, there's like a kind of a deer in the headlights look. But then sometimes, you get this kid from the barrio, maybe who hasn't been as well read, but they can right away apply that to their lived realities of some situation that they've been to in their life. And so I think that's a big deal. And, really valuing people's epistemological insights that come from their community, that come from their hood, from their barrio, is really, that's ancestral knowledge, like being mobilized. And it's huge. So I'll also make sure that I incorporate assignments that have them go into the community and really see that there are amazing people with so much knowledge and intellectual production, whether they're organic intellectuals or not, right, in the community, and so that they can actually actively kind of take advantage of that. And then in terms of like my research, that's a whole nother question in my scholarship, but like I only do work on women of color. That's kind of something that I actively do because I feel like it's so underrepresented, and there's just so many reasons that I do that. But also I'm a sociologist. I specialize in Latinx sociology. And so what I'll do is I'll use sociological methods mostly, but I'll impose ethnic studies theory. So I'm not using still, I refuse to be bound by disciplinary borders. I mean, they've put already too many borders on my people, so they're not about to do it to me now as a scholar. And so I really engage in that way, and I'll use their methods, and I'll incorporate some of my own methods, but then I use that theory to really create this kind of really engaged interdisciplinary model that you're not really going to find out there, in the mainstream scholarship. But interdisciplines like ethnic studies have so much to give. Like there's so much, people think that like you have to be in ethnic studies in order to really utilize those epistemologies and ontologies. And in reality, even the folks that are here in this panel with myself, like we do criminology, like it's the criminalization, racialization nexus, like it should automatically be a go-to. And so I try to think really innovatively about how I can kind of merge these worlds, because just like, on the ground, people are messy. We're not, linear in that way, and can't be contained.
Yeah, I do the same with my students in the sort of engaging the community, and in both of my community-based research classes this semester, I've created co-learning spaces with DC high school students and my college students. And we literally are meeting, like the high school students are taking a college class with me, and my students we're doing this peer education model. And really, I'm all about like flattening hierarchies as much as possible, especially what you all are saying about like who we're assigning and what expertise is and what knowledge is and ways of knowing are, right? And so I am very clear about the multiple ways of knowing, multiple forms of expertise, and cultural context and community members being experts, and that any titles, any letters after my name don't mean anything. What matters is how you show up in a space and how you work in partnership with community and what they need. One thing, I teach a class. I'm in a criminology department, but I actually have more of like a social work, feminist sort of studies background, and I teach a class because of my social work background with children and families. I teach a class called Navigating Childhood, which is about how inequality and public policy affect a child's experience of childhood. And that class is mostly documentaries, podcasts, guest speakers, and anything that's sort of lived experience of a child's experience, depending on the multiple oppressions that they may face or the multiple ways they may need to navigate their childhood. So I wanted to say something about that, about the importance when you're doing your syllabus design, like everyone said, of like not doing a syllabus audit and who you are assigning, you and your colleagues, assigning lived experiences with podcasts, documentaries, that sort of thing, but being very careful, to this sort of cliche at this point, but it's still a really important point, of the danger of the single story. So that because someone has an identity doesn't mean the tension that I have, that I'll be honest, that challenges me every day and in my work is I want my students to be in a place where they're not making assumptions about someone's background because of where they live, what their identities are, but also not also recognizing their privilege. Being very careful about the single story and being open to being surprised that person across the table from me, whether it's your classmate in the college classroom or the high school kid that we're working with or me, that like, you don't know what you don't know is one of my other things that they hear me say all the time, and just really pushing them on that. And also challenging stuff that comes up in our space, not being shy about being like, here's how what you just said landed. But you have to build that compassionate space from beginning where they're open to, you have to push them to their comfort zone to the point where they won't shut down and become defensive, but still have a space where you can have those conversations. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention, this is really important, and then I'll stop. I do a lot of racial justice work in my classes, and I do a lot of conversations specifically about racism and how it manifests, et cetera. I have learned in the last 7 years of doing this, we're having separate spaces for white students and students of color. Earlier in my career, I was like nervous about making that change, but I realized how harmful it was for the students of color to hear the white students first time sort of discovering that racism exists, and the students of color being like, oh my God, can you please stop talking? So I really recommend, if you all are thinking about doing this, so we did this, like John mentioned, this mandatory anti-oppression class for all students where this came up a lot. There's a really good article if you need to convince your university that we need to have separate spaces for these conversations. I'm going to put an article in the chat that's really helpful.
I'll just be brief because I know we've only gone through two questions, but I love that you talked about, Marisa, how you shared with your students that you appreciate their backgrounds. And I think it's crazy how much we can impact people as professors, right? This is my first semester teaching research methods, and I opened the first day sort of with that in mind. Like, I appreciate the diversity of your lived experiences, and you each have something to bring to the classroom, whether you know it or not. But even just, the way that we enact our policies, right? I had a student email me like, is it okay if I bring my baby? Like, I don't want to miss class. I'm like, yeah, girl, give me your baby. I'll hold him, like, and you were going to listen to lecture. Like, there's so many ways that we can be inclusive and intentional about teaching our students in a multiplicity of ways. Last week, my students qualitatively coded songs using grounded theory. And I had a student, code a Tupac song, and he's like, this is my favorite assignment that I've ever done. So I think we can just be intentional in so many ways. Our assignments, obviously our syllabi, the way that we, enact policies of what is classroom management and what's not, we have the power to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think you all raised great points. And when I think about criminal justice and criminology curriculum, I oftentimes, think how white and punitive it is for students of color. And so it was a great experience for me to be educated at HBCU, Texas Southern University, where our program, was a race and justice oriented program. So race and crime was a class we had to take. Race and crime was something that was included in our comps. So you weren't leaving out of Texas Southern without being a race and justice scholar. And so we were introduced to the great work of Dr. Helen Taylor Green, Dr. Georgia Sabayi, Dr. Kalutha Crumpton, and others. But also, I think it's important for us to change some of the books and theorists that we use in criminology. So when I teach criminology, there are often times that I rely on Dr. Green's, Gabadon's, and Young's African-American classics in criminology and criminal justice, which is a classic. I recommend everybody go to Amazon or wherever you get your books and purchase a copy as soon as possible. Well, probably not Amazon right now, because I know a lot of people are boycotting Amazon. So not right now, but I mean, the book is a classic, and I think it definitely needs to be featured in criminal justice and in criminology curriculums, because it highlights the work of Black scholars who have contributed to criminological and sociological thought. And I'm also thinking about Marisa's comment about how oftentimes I always say that the greatest scholars, right, aren't in academia. They're in the hoods and barrios and in prisons. Because oftentimes when I do my reentry work, I'm not amazed, but I'm blown away by the genius and intelligence, right, that's oftentimes is oppressed and trapped. And so I think it's important for scholars to know that, you're not really the most intelligent or knowledgeable person about these issues, right? The people who experience oppression daily, who have the lived experience, who don't have the privilege or opportunities to be in our spaces, are the ones with the knowledge. And so I think we need to always foreground their experiences and try to uplift people from marginalized communities. And so, like, especially if you're at a minority serving institution, we need to be inspiring our students to be change agents. And we also need to be relatable. And many of our students don't buy into respectability politics, and we need to embrace that as well. And like some of you have mentioned, how oftentimes we as people of color can internalize anti-Blackness or anti-BIPOC-ness, right? And we can maintain systems of oppression and exclusion. And that can be extremely harmful to our students, especially when we're giving them advice that is counter to their lived experiences and their realities. And so I think that's important as well. So my next question for everyone is, so you all have engaged in anti-racist praxis. Have you faced any resistance due to your commitment to anti-racism, and how do you navigate that resistance?
I think as a grad student, and Amy alluded to it for sure. So I was like, yes, when we get a job, like, I'm naming names. I have a laundry list of people that have done me dirty. And just because I don't have a job, I'm not going to say your name. But I think, at least as a grad student, it's hard sometimes. It's almost like I've had to pick my battles just because of the power, the power differential. I don't want, I don't have a job. I don't have security. And it's been difficult, oftentimes, like, I'm not going to lie, there's been instances where faculty have, said microaggressions to me. People in the field have said some things that are literally racist AF. And, I've gone to some of my colleagues, trusted mentors, and oftentimes it's been like a pick and choose your battles. I've learned that I can't fight every battle personally in my own experience, because I don't know if I'd still be here. And it's just hard because it's like nobody prepared you for the amount of invisible and emotional labor you would do as a graduate student, right? Like mentoring other graduate students. I have a really good mentor that I sought from the graduate studies department. She's a Black woman. I don't have any women of color in my department, at least when I started out, that could be mentors to me. And she's like, hey, you got to teach, we just got this first year, you got to teach her how to code switch. Like, it's crazy. You never expected to have to do all these extra things navigating these spaces. And it's definitely been tough sometimes to pick, like, okay, I'm going to tear this down, or you know what, like, I can't do what I want to right now, but like, wait till I get a job. So absolutely, I'm with you, Amy.
Yeah, I feel like this is like a really hard question because, like, Alondra mentioned, like, when you're a graduate student, and then, like for myself, like, I'm like a working class, darker skinned Chicana from, the West Coast, like coming into the East Coast in a, pro cop loving like department / college. I feel like one of the ways that I've engaged in like resistance is like by my aesthetics alone, and not like playing at politics or refusal to respectability politics, right? Like, I would come into my department intentionally with grills, snapbacks, colored makeup, just to like show like, hey, you may dictate what I have to read, what I have to do in terms of like, scholarship or papers, but you can't break like my human spirit, right? And so I think for me, that's been like empowering, because it's like it's almost like a double consciousness, right? Like, they'll see whatever they want to see and interpret it however they want to, right? I did have like a faculty member ask me like, oh, like, why don't you, speak in class? We want to see your intelligence. And like, I couldn't help but respond like, I'm not a monkey, like, if you want to know what I think about XYZ, then go read my work. Or like, why don't you, help me get some kind of, partnership with a professor to, produce some work or whatever. Like, I'm not just going to perform my intelligence because I'm the only Chicana in my cohort in this department, right? But I feel like ironically enough, the department has found its ways of like disciplining me to like, behave a certain way. So to be honest, I kind of just avoid my department. Like, it's because as Alondra mentioned, right? Like, you got to pick and choose your battles, especially as a graduate student. You can't just say, fuck you to the department chair or whoever's, antagonizing you, or, trying to suppress your innovative ways of really diversifying the academy as the academy wants us to do. But when we really try to do it, it's like, oh, wait, we didn't mean that kind of diversification of the academy, right? So if anything, just like, my physical presence in and of itself has helped me be able to maintain some level of integrity to myself, my family, my community, who, like you mentioned, Sean, right? Like, I think I'm safe to say for all of us, like, we do it for the people we love and care about, right? Not for the accolades, because we already know that that system's already rigged, right?
I would say I just have so many things I would say, but everything what everybody's saying is really resonating with me. I've been called Maria several times. I have been confused with, at the time, basically the only other Chicana in the department who looks absolutely nothing like me. It's just been so many things. I mean, one story is that one year, so we know that the way that the university codifies diversity is really problematic, really problematic. They're bringing in folks who come in with a lot of privilege from various countries that have their socioeconomic status, and compared to those of us that are underrepresented in the academy, it's just, they call that diversity, right? So of course, what do? But mobilize Black and Brown, boom, sociology collective together at once. We draft a statement, we go in, we're ready, deliver it to the chair of the department. The chair wants to have a meeting, is very upset, meets with me, a former chair, meets with us, and essentially starts like going in on why would we say that, that's so problematic, you should know better in the professional field, like really trying to give me like this white woman respectability professional lashing, right? Like a public one. That's not going to happen. So, she then tells, I explained to her, how diversity actually works in real life. And she goes on to say, telling me that I need to be comfortable with other intellectuals disagreeing with my opinion. She's a white woman telling one of the only women in color in the department that I need to be comfortable in a professional space of having other people disagree with me, as if I don't experience that every single day in academia, right? So those are just kind of some of the experiences that I have when I do anti-racist work. Another thing that's very frustrating is like kind of alluding to kind of like what Amy was saying, is that they know that scholars of color, or even some of these brilliant scholars here on this panel with me, that are not people of color, that are white, have a really amazing amount of knowledge surrounding anti-racist work. So what do? They hit us up because they know that we know the jargon, we know the lingo, we know the problems. And so, when the university gets a slap on their wrist and saying, oh, we got to do better, they hit us up because they want our ideas. And then they put us on these committees. We do all of this work. I mean, we really go in and we try to do a good job and make it meaningful and like to create systemic change. And then what happens? It like goes off, the department waters it down, and then the final proposal looks absolutely nothing. They depoliticize it completely. And so then it just goes over and over, and then it's let's make another committee and another committee and another committee. And then pretty soon it's like you're over it because you've been working so hard and nothing has changed. So I think that the university kind of relies on the burnout of scholars of color and anti-racist scholars, because they're like, no, like, in time, like they'll go out, and oftentimes what I'm actually seeing in various departments across my university is that they also know which scholars are going to be the scholars that are less radical and more likely to kind of be, their model graduate students that will play the respectability game. And then it's not actually like reaching the radical kind of conditions and changes that we actually want. So it's just such an incredibly complicated topic with all of the various ways. Because even Sean, when you were talking about it, and I was really thinking about it, you were saying that you, in your grad program, that you had to take a class on race and criminology. And so what you see is that the folks that are within criminology that are of color, and I'm specifically even thinking about Black scholars, Black criminologists, address things like racism and police brutality, and often are qualitative. And then you're the one person in that department who teaches that. But then what happens? Students are in charge of your evals. And then because the neoliberal university commodifies everything, they essentially value you based on what students kind of perceive as being threatening or non-threatening. And so then that again impacts your livelihood and your ability to kind of go on. So again, I just want to stress, because I specifically look at one of the areas that I look at are institutional inequalities, specifically for Latina academics. So this is like a topic that's near and dear to me, but all of these things are so completely intertwined. It's just a very complicated topic.
I have something very brief to add. Do we have time, Sean?
Yeah.
Okay. Related to what you just said, I was thinking about this question, and I've been at my university for several years. American University has the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. So the types of resistance that I faced in some of the work was like manageable and navigatable. But with your point about the teaching valuations, I just wanted to amplify, because I'm in a non-tenure track position, whether I get reappointed is pretty much 100% my teaching evaluations. So when I started in my position, I didn't show my tattoos. I wasn't sure if I should come out as queer. I maybe dressed in a way that I don't usually dress because I was like terrified of like keeping my job. but I've been moved to a multi-year contract, which gave me more security. And then I started being me. Like my second year or third year, I got a multi-year instead of a single year. And then I felt like I could relax a little bit because I knew I'd have a job next year, assuming, and I started to be me in the classroom and with my students and office hours in everything. And my teaching evaluations were great, right? Like, because they appreciated the authenticity, and the queer students were like, I've never had a queer professor before. And thank you. Like, you made me feel comfortable. I could talk to you about that. I've never told anyone this or whatever, right? And it changed everything for me. And so now when I mentor doc students, I'm just like, be you, just like everyone on this panel is amazingly you, because that's what students need in their mentors and the people that they learn from, and we learn from them and they learn from us. And it's really beautiful. And I'm so relieved that I got on a multi-year because I was able to make that switch that radically changed the quality of my experience as a professor.
Yeah.
Well, Sean, I'll only talk, but I know we only have 5 minutes. So do you want to move into Q&A?
No, feel free to chime in, Aaron. I would like to hear your perspective.
Yeah, so, I currently find myself in experiencing a lot of resistance as it relates to my anti-racist work, both within my university and within the discipline, as it relates to the Division on Women and Crime specifically. Most of the resistance I get is as it relates to my tone and the way in which I go about doing anti-racist work, because my mother uses every word that is in her arsenal and in her toolkit, and I also tend to not police my language. Fuck, shit, crap, white supremacy are all part of my vocabulary, and I use them often. I'm never directed harmfully at anyone, but when sometimes there is no other word to, express my frustration and how disheartened I am. And so I've received, mostly about respectability, mostly about, considering the way in which I call out white supremacy in open forums at the college and department level, in these safe spaces where we're supposed to be able to talk about these topics. And then, I find out 4 days later that I'm reported to HR for undermining inclusion efforts as it relates to white men. And it's almost laughable because, and we're all laughing because then I have to go in and discuss about how it wasn't actually my comments that were problematic. It was the white male colleagues' comments that were problematic and make people feel uncomfortable, that I was addressing those problematic, comments. And, so I hear a lot about that I need to consider the ways in which I talk to particularly other white female and white male colleagues, that I need to tone down my language, that I need to appear less angry, but I'm not angry. Well, I am angry, but this is also just the way that I talk, and people need to get used to it. I'm from Los Angeles. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I have a Valley Girl demeanor. We talk with passion about the things that we care about. I'm in a very privileged position. If I were to lose my job, I would have an amazing mother to return home to, and she would love if I would return to Los Angeles and live with her. And so I just navigate my life daring the academy to kick me out, daring my department to kick me out, daring my college and university to kick me out, daring the discipline. Because the reality is on paper, I look great. I have a great CV. I have great teaching evaluations. I give back to my students. I love my students. A care ethic and a love ethic is part of my teaching. And, I'm going to do the work that I think is important. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah, great points. And I often think about how oftentimes institutions will tone police how the oppressed and marginalized respond to oppression. So instead of focusing on the harms that come from white supremacy or unfair institutional practices, oftentimes we're focusing on how people communicate or how they respond to that oppression. And that's extremely harmful and problematic. And so I think we need to really examine so-called notions of professionalism, because we oftentimes find that those are deeply seated in whiteness, which is counter to anti-racism, right? And so I think that we need to listen to people who are experiencing oppression, who are challenging systems of white supremacy and inequality. And we need to foreground solutions based on the experiences of those who have the courage to speak up. Because everybody doesn't have that courage, unfortunately. And especially in an academy where careerism oftentimes rules the day, right? So, let me just focus on getting tenure. Let me just put my head down because I want to be a dean, or I want to be a provost, or I want to be a president. So let me just shut up and allow these institutions to harm people. And I think we need to get away from that. And that's why, I commend, and I'm so inspired by all of you, because you all are fearless. You all don't give a damn, right? You fight for what's right, and you'll deal with the potential retaliation and consequences later, right? And that's just amazing. I think we need more scholars and activists like you all in the academy. So we're at 8 o'clock. I saw a couple of questions in the Q&A. So we're going to head over to the Q&A just so we can have enough time to answer all the questions. So if you have a question, now is the time to post it in the Q&A.
Hi, Sean. Our first question is, does anyone on the panel feel they could share a clear story or example of how academics of color have adopted WS, not sure what WS means, maybe you do, perspective practice, and how it concretely impacts and constrains the next generation of scholarship? Could you give us a live, I don't know about that, case study, to quote Alondra? What is the cost to the future of anti-violence work of this limiting phenomenon? Thank you. Great session.
I can give a little example of that. I remember when I was an undergrad, I didn't have the vocabulary at the time, right, to like identify as a police abolitionist because I had never heard of the word abolition before. But I just knew that I was like anti-cops and like anti-prisons, right? And I remember when I would like try to write in my scholarship, like, we need to get rid of the police. I had professors of color tell me that that wasn't realistic, right? And that if I wanted to get published, that I probably shouldn't write that. Only to come to find that some of those professors now are talking about police abolition and being on board with police abolition because now it's the sexy term in criminology, criminal justice, and sociology or whatever, right? And so, I'm not sure exactly how we can get to a place where, we can re-radicalize professors of color in the academy who have made it. Because thus far, what I've seen, right, as a graduate student, most professors of color in the academy, and I'm talking about specifically criminology or criminal justice, and I would probably say sociology as well, like these folks are not coming from the barrio or the hood, first and foremost, right? Like they're most likely like middle class or upper class, like people of color. So it's like very refreshing when I do get to meet the Seans, the Jasons, the Marisas in the academy, because it's like, great, now I can have a band of folks of color that understand where I come from because they come from those similar backgrounds. And we are literally, what I'm seeing, the new wave, a generation of scholars who are pushing, the boundaries of the discipline, but also just the way that we think about and practice being academics, right? So I don't know if that was an answer that the person who asked the question wanted, but that's what I got.
I also think that as it relates to white women, we see a lot of white women holding on to their proximity to white supremacy to elevate their own careers and, kind of buying into white feminist ideals and, ideas about professionalism and, really upholding those systems of oppression because they are extremely privileged. We are very privileged because of our proximity to white supremacy. And I think that, what has been really eye-opening over the last couple of years in the groups that I belong to within the academy is how purposefully white women will not want to take on this broader fight of to address inequalities, and how, you know, it's almost compartmentalized, that, you know, that I do my gender work and my anti-racism work when I'm here, but not when I'm doing XYZ, not when I'm teaching, not when I'm mentoring, not when I'm guest editing you know, a journal, not when I'm presenting at a conference, not when I'm in these public spheres. And so they identify themselves as, you know, feminist scholars, intersectional scholars, but it's really compartmentalized. And when it benefits them, or when it's easy, or when it's the most comfortable. And I think that that's something that, you know, white women specifically need to kind of investigate and ask ourselves why we only engage in this work among certain, you know, in certain company. Like, of course, it's really easy to do this work on this panel because everyone on this panel are amazing anti-racist scholar activists. But are you doing that work when you're also in your, you know, faculty meeting? And I'm speaking specifically to white women.
Thank you. This next question is for Amy. Starts off with, great point, Amy. I think a lot of CJ departments are very police friendly. For anyone on the panel, how do we talk to students who want to be police officers about anti-racist policing without being accused of being anti-police?
Oh, I don't give a fuck about like coming off as anti-cop or whatever, because like what Erin was mentioning earlier, like when I go back to my community, right, like I'm seeing people getting killed by police, right? So I can give a fuck about what a professor or student thinks about, oh, we should, you know, understand how police feel or whatever, like, no. So in my class that I teach on penology, I do go over police abolition. But before I even get to that point, I like to bring in a little lecture on the history of the United States through the perspective of people of color. And sometimes I struggle with it because I feel like I don't want to make my students be part of like some voyeuristic, you know, colonial gaze of like, oh, look at how all these different marginalized communities have been fucked over by, you know, legal systems in the US or vigilantism or police officers or whatever. But sometimes I feel like there's some power in shocking students with actual visual images, videos of people getting killed so that they can see, hey, like, if you haven't seen this before, like, you're going to see it today. And I want you to feel uncomfortable and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, because again, like there's real life people in our society that are experiencing these state sanctioned forms of violence and oppression, repression, and elimination every day. And you're here in a classroom for 60 minutes, you know what I mean? So I off the rip, you know, give them a decolonial historical lesson to contextualize why I am a prison and police abolitionist. I think that's so important. And I have found that oftentimes when students are confronted with a real history, you know, a revisionist history of the United States, they come to be a little more critical about why they themselves are pro-police or they're neutral on issues pertaining to policing. So yeah.
I completely agree, Amy. Also, over the past 5 years that I've been in Texas, I've at least had 10 students come back to me and say that they came into my class wanting to be a police officer or a correctional officer, and then actually changing their entire career trajectory, either changing their major to victim studies or going into another field because of what they learned in my class. And, you know, it's a joke, but I often say like one Texan at a time. Like, I'm not going to, I'm not going to kind of muddy what I want to say and how I feel and my perspective, so I don't come off anti-police, because I am anti-police, and they'll be exposed to people who are really hardcore pro-police. And so, you know, I think that the university is a setting where students need to be exposed to a diverse range of perspectives as it relates to how people view these institutions, because often I may be the only person that they encounter who has these ideas, and that may be enough. Like, I'm not going to change their whole worldview in 16 weeks, but I can at least say confidently that like at least 10 students decided that they were going to go into more community service or victim services because they realized that policing maybe wasn't the institution they thought it was.
Yeah, I found a helpful resource is showing my students the documentary Crime and Punishment, which covers the story of the NYPD 12, who were 12 courageous cops of color in the NYPD who stood up to racist policing. They called out some of the racist policies and practices that they were forced to enforce in New York. And also at William Patterson, we have a very, especially in the criminal justice and criminology department, we have a very diverse student body. And I think that, me being a Black male with locks that can relate to our students, they're willing to open up. And so we have these honest conversations about policing. I share my experiences with policing, being racially profiled, being harmed by police in many instances, before I was in the academy and when I've been in the academy. And that provides a lot of my students with the comfort, right, to share their experiences. And then we have these conversations amongst white students. And so white students begin to re-examine their perceptions of police and what it means to be an ethical police officer, what it means to protect citizens' rights, what it really means to serve. And so I just think that it's important for criminal justice and criminology departments to start hiring more scholars of color so we can begin to change some of students' perceptions about police. We can hopefully have students who are going into these institutions wanting to change them, like the NYPD 12, because they have effectuated change in the city and are trying to be more involved and are trying to change policing in communities of color. Because many of our students, right, they actually want to be change agents. So I think we just need to find a way to promote their passion into wanting to become better police officers that can actually serve our communities instead of oppressing and harming communities. And of course, right, we can get into the defund police, but all of our students don't have that perspective. And so I'm also careful with how I teach, because I don't want to, there are students who really want to go into the system. So I don't ever want to deter a student from trying to pursue their passions and their dreams. But I do point out the realities and how oppressive police it has been historically and how it continues to harm communities of color.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I was just gonna really quickly say that in terms of how to teach about the anti-racist policing without being accused of anti-police, I think that what has worked for me is I give the historical breakdown. I am assigning folks like Robin Kelly, I'm actually going in and I'm not doing the traditional text so that people can actually see the history behind the fact that these are completely racially and capitalistically based, right? And so I'm not explicitly telling them, and students know my politics, but I'm not hitting them over the head with it. I want them to come into it into their own, right? That to me, that is not my role personally. And plus, as a woman of color, I already know how it's gonna go. So I want them to get through that journey on their own accord. So like I said, I will give the history of policing. I'll start there. I'll give folks from ethnic studies, from history, all these things. And then on, as we get to the contemporary, what I'll do is actually we'll talk about, okay, well, what does defunding the police actually mean? So what I'll do is I'll actually talk about all the things that money could actually do for the community and what community support and collective and coalition building amongst and mutual aid groups and all that stuff, what that could actually look like. And what actually is very interesting, I think this could be useful for other folks that are educators, is that I start talking to them about like what is actually fair, not just like fair on the ground, but does it make sense for police to be responding to calls that have to do with mental health and to crises that they're actually not trained on, right? And so even though I have a very distinct perspective, students are like, oh yeah, that's not fair to them. That's not fair to them. And I feel like that is like a really useful approach, because like I taught social inequalities this summer, and there was no way I wasn't going to do it on the racialization criminalization nexus with everything popping off, right? So I did it on that, and I had one student who was this white female student was so insistent. Like come to find out, her dad was a police officer, her brother was a police officer. It was like multi-generational type of thing. And in the end, she ended up really loving the class and decided to keep taking classes with me. So I think that for me personally, I like to, give them what I can and then have them kind of come along with me on the journey so that they feel that they're coming up to this whole thing of like, maybe policing isn't the answer.
Yeah, I try to create like a compassionate, empathetic place, but I still stay in my ground around these topics. So my department over the last 10 years that I've been in it has moved a lot towards a lot of Homeland Security and counterterrorism students, because we're in Washington, D.C. and Department of Homeland Security is literally across the street. So this wasn't the department that I first joined in 2009 when I entered as a PhD student. And so I tend to teach in a lot of other departments, but I do still have to teach in my home department. But I had a student in a research, I teach research mostly. So what I can use is data. Thank you, researchers who are doing this work. And I had a student say, I want to do my final paper on factors other than race associated with Black men getting killed by police. And I said, all right, the literature is pretty strong. Go look, see what you can find. And he comes back and the literature is pretty strong, right? Like I can rely on what the data show. And we had maybe 3 or 4 conversations about it, because I was like, this is not happening. You are not doing your paper on this topic, but we're going to work together and I'm going to show you the literature is pretty strong in this area. And I brought my doc student in so that she could see how I engaged in those conversations with him. And I've sort of checked a few times who's on this webinar, but I also know that's being recorded. So I do want to be careful about what I say. But it was challenging for me as a professor because my head was exploding. Very much so. Like I was enraged, but I wanted to model for her, like, okay, let's talk about it. But I'm also not, I'm still firm, but also I use it as a moment, like, let's look at the literature. What does it say? And then he figured out a different final project topic. So.
Thank you all. There's quite a number of compliments in the Q&A, but I'll hold those till the end and we'll get to the next question. As a white woman, first generation from a very rural community who is anti-racist, how do we avoid coming across as white savior?
Feel free to reach out to me. I've got lots of stuff to share on that. I basically have a class I teach on that pretty much for my community-based learning classes. I think the main things I'll say, and then I'll shut up, are listen more than you talk. You're not the expert. You don't know what you don't know. Like all this humility stuff of sort of, and not feeling there's anything to be saved, like, or any, so I think the other thing that I'll say is it's about not falling into deficit thinking of the communities you're working with, and thinking about language you're using, like achievement gap. What about calling it education debt instead of achievement gap? What about, how do we have a strengths-based, assets-based approach in our work with communities that isn't about all the problems, but is uplifting all the amazing things going on and having the community working with whoever else wants to be involved in making the change they want to see made? But I'm happy to talk more if you want to email me more about it, because I've spent some time on this personally and also with my students that I mentor in this space.
I would also say, Teresa, as a person of color, sometimes when like I'm around white folks, I feel like they feel like they gotta overcompensate and really prove that they're anti-racist or that they're down with the brown or down with the cause. And for me, it's just that in itself is off-putting. So honestly, I think that if you're just yourself and you make genuine relationships with the people that you're engaging with or researching or whatever, that people will like recognize your genuineness and will bring you in, right? And I feel like anti-racist work is like a long journey. Like, just because I'm a person of color doesn't mean I'm perfect. Like, I'm problematic myself every day, all day. You know what I mean? But I do my best to always, emphasize like my understanding of the impact of whatever my actions are and can be, even within my own spheres and within communities of color. But then also like reminding myself and others like the importance of, intent, right? So I would just say like, be genuine, right? Like really think about why you're in those spaces in the first place, right?
I think for me, the more I educate myself on how this is a racism problem that white people in America have caused, that it's rooted in white nationalism and white supremacy, that it's you can't even see it as like they're, like Jane said, people that need to be saved. It's more like disrupting the systems that I have created, that my people have created, that have caused these circumstances and these lived experiences that intentionally kill other folks, marginalize other folks, and oppress folks based on the color of their skin. And so I think that, doing the internal work and understanding, like a great book is They Were Her Property, about white women's complicity in slavery, because we always hear about, property owners, white men particularly, being the kind of face of white supremacy and slavery, but also white women have a long, violent role in America. And so I think that has been really crucial for my own development. But I'm going to be quiet because the train's going by right now and it will not shut up for another 5 minutes.
I think just to add on, this has all been really good feedback. I think in terms of how do I not come off as like I'm trying to save you, intentionality for sure. Like, am I doing this to like pat myself on the back? Like, is my CV going to benefit if I do this like D&E committee? Like, if that's the intentionality behind it, like, or you're trying to like collect graduate students of color, like, that's sort of not the framework with which you should be approaching this. Like, no, you don't deserve a pat on the back. Like, just do the work, like be behind, the anti-racist like Praxis, and not for any sort of reward. I think that's important as well.
Thank you. The next question is, I would love to hear all your thoughts on intersectionality disciplines and separations of knowledge are also centered in colonial white supremacist, in parentheses, infrastructures. So how can we break down these walls and facilitate more intersectional work and collaborate with other dope scholars of color in other fields, especially when we are often the only doctoral student of color in our cohort? It is often so hard to find community and have allies to fight these systems when you are on your own in your department.
I would say, so I'm big on intersectionality, like really, really big. The real world doesn't exist in silos. We don't exist in a compartmentalized way that's completely a white supremacist colonial way of thinking, right? And so to approach any type of research or empiricism in a way that is not intersectional means that it's incomplete and you're not telling the full story. It's wrong. This is a debate that I have been having for a very long time in my discipline. But with that being said, I would say first off, be friends with me and Amy. Well, you can start there. But I would say another thing is try to see if there are other folks in other departments, like other folks of color that do radical work in other departments in your institution. I would also say try to get involved in like various associations. So for me, like it would be like the American Sociological Association or ASC, like any of those things. I've been able to meet like Sean and Jason and Michael, like all these really cool people over and over in ways that I would have never been able to meet on my campus. And then that will open up doors to type of like collaborating and coalition building. But it's awkward. I completely understand in terms of, you know, being isolated as a person of color in your program or specifically in your cohort, but you kind of have to put yourself out there if you really want to do this work. Like it's very difficult for various reasons, just the doctoral program alone, to do it alone and in isolation. It'll really get to you. The quicker that you build community and find your gente, find your people, the easier it'll be. And that will open up doors, not only for opportunities, but also just for building community and feeling better about your sense of self. Like that's where I would start.
Yeah, I think about a conversation that I had with Dr. Jennifer Ortiz, and she was kind of sharing with me some advice she received from one of her mentors, Dr. Douglas Tompkins, and he was, you know, telling her that when you become a professor, you need to reach back and grab others, and so that's kind of been something that, you know, I have just tried to embrace, because it was a very lonely and challenging process. And I guess if it wasn't for my, you know, one of my mentors, Dr. Jason Williams, who provided me with opportunities and access to, you know, to opportunities and networks, you know, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. So I'm always appreciative of people who have reached back and grabbed me. And so I find it's my duty to reach back and try to help others any way that I can. I think as scholars of color or marginalized scholars in general, we all need to look out for each other in the various ways that we can, right? So if we have institutional support, perhaps we could use some of that to pull up some of our colleagues at other institutions, or if you're creating projects, right? If you're creating book projects, or if you're over a special issue, right? You need to try to look out for scholars of color who are marginalized, especially scholars who do critical work, who oftentimes find it hard to get their scholarship published in most venues. So I just think we need to use our networks and resources and social capital to try to help out others.
I think also just like, I know for me, like in my department, like there wasn't like a space for Chicanas or Chicanos, like, because I think I'm the only one now at this point. There was another Chicana, but she graduated this last year. So I just created my own damn space, right? Like I created this collective called Colibri, and I tapped into my own networks of Latina, Chicana identified women. And then of course they have their own networks, right? So then this collective, which Marisa is also a part of, you know, we brought in different people from different universities across the United States, and across discipline. And now we're like, you know, I mean, I would say these are my homegirls, you know, like these are people that I fuck with in real life and also in the academy, right? So for me, it's important to be able to tap into those, like your own tribe, right? Because that inevitably will link you to other people, and then you can start working on projects, you know, across discipline. Like I know two of our other Colibri members, you know, different departments, different universities, they're literally across the United States from each other, and now they're working on a paper together. You know what I mean? So if you can't find the space, then create the space. That's what I would say.
Thank you. For the moment, there's no more questions, but we do have a lot of nice comments if you'd like me to read them. Just wanted to thank everyone for their bravery and amazingness and for doing this fantastic panel. So exciting and encouraging to hear all your brave voices and actions in academia. Thank you. Thank you all for a great panel and for your important work. And finally, this panel is phenomenal. Thank you all for such an empowering discussion. And another one just came in just now. Y'all are role models. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And I also want to thank my amazing colleagues for agreeing to share your knowledge with us tonight. You know, I'm leaving this conversation motivated and inspired. And I also want to again thank Pete and Brian from IRT here at William Patterson for their phenomenal work and for assisting us with the technical component of this panel. And for those of you all who are interested in receiving the video for this panel, You can shoot me an email at wilsons47@wpunj.edu, wilsons47@wpunj.edu, or you can shoot me a message on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Sean K. Wilson at Twitter, Dr. Sean K. Wilson. And again, thank you all for joining us tonight. It truly was an honor. And thank you to the amazing panelists tonight. Take care, everybody.